The hum of the quantum stabilizer echoed softly in the darkened lab, its pale blue glow illuminating the sea of papers and complex equations scattered across the room. Leora sat at her desk, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the surface as her eyes scanned the data streaming across the holoscreen. She adjusted her glasses, staring intently at the delicate machinery in front of her. After years of tireless work, she was on the verge of something monumental, unlocking the secret to time manipulation. For as long as she could remember, Leora had been obsessed with time. Time was the one thing she could never control, the one thing that had always slipped through her fingers. Every fleeting moment was a reminder of lost opportunities, of things left unsaid and undone. But now, all that was about to change. Astra, she said, addressing the AI assistant hovering as a small holographic orb beside her. Run another diagnostic on the quantum stabilizer. Again. Astra's voice, though metallic, carried a note of sarcasm. You know, for someone who's on the verge of the greatest scientific discovery in human history, you sure do love double-checking. Leora couldn't help but smile at the AI's quip. Just do it, as Astra complied. Running the necessary checks, Leora allowed herself a brief moment of hope. If she succeeded, if her equations held, she could bend time. Not enough to rewrite history, but just enough to peer into the future, or maybe send a signal back. She had no plans of playing with fire, not yet. All she wanted was a glimpse of what lay ahead. Suddenly, a series of beeps echoed from the stabilizer. Leora's heart raced. She checked the screen, everything seemed stable, but there was an anomaly. A spike in energy she hadn't predicted. What's happening? Astra, she asked, frowning at the readouts. An unusual temporal displacement, Astra replied, the usual humor gone from her voice. It's increasing. Before Leora could react, the room began to pulse with a strange light. The air seemed to thicken, warping in front of her eyes. She backed away, her pulse quickening as the hum of the stabilizer grew into a deafening roar. Sparks flew from the console, and then, with a blinding flash, the machine shut down. Leora blinked, her vision adjusting to the dim light. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her hands trembled slightly as she took a step forward. The air smelled faintly of ozone, the familiar scent of an electrical malfunction. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized something or someone was standing in the center of the room. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark, weathered clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. He was breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the room as if he was trying to figure out where he was. Who are you? She demanded, her voice steady despite the chaos of her thoughts. The man's gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. His eyes were a deep, stormy gray, filled with something she couldn't quite place, pain, perhaps, or desperation. I'm Cassian, he said, his voice hoarse but firm, and I need your help for a moment. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. The lab was unnervingly still, save for the faint hum of machines recovering from the overload. Leora stood frozen, her mind racing to make sense of the impossible sight before her. Cassian, if that was his name, was not just any man. He had appeared out of thin air, materializing within the very space where she had been working on her time manipulation experiment. What do you mean? You need my help. Leora's voice was sharper than she intended. She was overwhelmed not just by the man's sudden appearance, but by the sheer impossibility of it all. Cassian inhaled slowly, trying to steady his breathing. His muscles tensed as if he expected danger at any moment. I don't have time to explain everything right now, but what you're working on, your research, is more important than you know. The future, my world, it's falling apart. Your work will save or doom what's left of humanity. Leora blinked, her skepticism rising. This had to be some kind of prank, or worse, an elaborate attempt to sabotage her work. Look, I don't know who you are, but whatever this is, you're wasting my time. The doors behind you. Cassian's jaw tightened. It's not that simple. His eyes, stormy gray and haunted, locked with hers, and for a brief moment, Leora felt a flicker of something, fear maybe, or the sheer weight of the responsibility he claimed she bore. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice quieter now, more uncertain. He took a step closer, and she noticed a slight limp in his stride, the weariness in his posture. This wasn't the bearing of someone playing a trick on her. Whoever he was, he had been through something. I'm from the year 3150, Cassian said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I've come here to stop the end of everything. Leora's heart skipped a beat, the air between them thick with tension. 3150. Time travel was theoretical, barely even in the realm of possibility. She glanced at Astra, the AI assistant who hovered silently, still analyzing the readings. There was no denying that Cassian had appeared at the precise moment when the stabilizer malfunctioned. It was no coincidence. Leora crossed her arms, trying to maintain some control of the situation. Let's assume for a second that I believe you, she said cautiously. Why me? Why is my work so important to the future? Cassian's expression darkened, his gaze flickering to the array of complex equipment that filled her lab. Because he said, in your time, you're on the verge of a discovery that will change everything. You and your mentor, Dr. Rune, will develop technology capable of manipulating time. At first, it will be used for good, solving resource shortages, preventing natural disasters, but eventually, that power will fall into the wrong hands. He paused, his eyes reflecting a grief that ran deep. In my time, those hands belong to the authority, a regime that rules over the remnants of Earth with an iron fist. They used your technology to control everything: people, resources, history itself. They've created a dystopia where freedom no longer exists, and humanity is barely surviving. But that's not the worst of it. Leora frowned, her mind racing through possibilities. What do you mean, the worst? Cassian's voice grew colder, harsher, as if the memory alone was enough to freeze him inside. In the near future, someone will use your technology to tear a rift in time, one so unstable that it will eventually collapse. That collapse will unravel the very fabric of reality, and the entire universe will cease to exist. His eyes locked onto hers, pleading for understanding. I've seen it happen. The world you know, the stars, everything, gone. I'm here to prevent that. A chill ran down Leora's spine, but she forced herself to keep a steady expression. His words felt too heavy, too outlandish to be real, and yet, the desperation in his voice, the weariness etched into his every movement, it felt real. Leora took a step back, pacing as she processed his claim. So, let me get this straight. You traveled from the future minus 3,150, you said, because my research leads to some kind of time catastrophe. You think you can just walk into my lab and ask me to, what, stop? Throw everything I've worked for into the trash? Cassian's gaze softened for the first time, a hint of empathy cutting through his stoic demeanor. I know what I'm asking is impossible. I know how much this must mean to you. But this isn't just about one lifetime's work. This is about saving everyone who comes after us. If we can stop it now, we prevent the future from being destroyed. His words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Leora could feel the intensity of his gaze, the unspoken emotion swirling in the depths of his eyes. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that he was here for a reason, that he had come back in time to save them all. But she was a scientist. She needed proof. What exactly are you asking me to do? She asked finally, her voice quiet. Cassian took a deep breath, as though bracing himself for her reaction. There's a moment in the near future, a key moment that sets everything into motion. A decision you make. I don't know the specifics, but I know that this decision leads to the development of a time weapon that the authority uses to tear apart the timeline. We need to stop that decision before it happens. Leora frowned. A time weapon? What are you talking about? Cassian's expression hardened. It's called the Chronosith. It was designed by the authority using your research. They found a way to manipulate time on a massive scale, weaponizing it to control history, to erase people, events, entire civilizations from existence. It was supposed to be a tool for peace, something to protect humanity, but instead, it became a weapon of control. Leora's heart raced. But I never intended for my work to be used like that. I wanted to help people, to fix things. I know, Cassian said softly, his voice filled with an unspoken sorrow. But good intentions aren't enough. That's why I'm here, to make sure your work never falls into the wrong hands. For a long moment, Leora didn't respond. She stared at the floor, her mind churning through the implications of what he was saying. She had always known that her research had the potential to change the world, but she had never imagined it could lead to something so dark, so destructive. Finally, she looked up, meeting his gaze. What do you need me to do? Cassian stepped closer, closing the distance between them. His voice was low, almost a whisper. We need to find the moment, the tipping point when your work gets corrupted. Once we identify it, we stop it before it can happen. But that means we'll have to go into the future. Leora felt a shiver run down her spine. You want me to go with you? Cassian's eyes locked onto hers, and she saw the intensity of his resolve and something else, something deeper. I need you with me, Leora. You're the only one who can stop this. But more than that, he hesitated, the words catching in his throat. I don't want to do this alone. The raw vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. For the first time, Leora realized that beneath the hardened exterior, Cassian was just as afraid as she was. He had seen things, experienced things that had broken him in ways she couldn't yet understand. And despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, she felt a strange pull toward him, a connection that defied logic. Leora nodded, her voice steady. I'm in. Let's stop this. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Leora and Cassian worked side by side, reviewing every detail of her research, searching for the critical point in time where everything went wrong. Each hour that passed brought them closer, not just in their mission, but emotionally. Their late-night discussions about science and the future slowly evolved into personal conversations about their fears, their regrets, and the unspoken attraction that simmered between them. Cassian told her about the future, about the world he came from. He spoke of a time where humanity had spread to the stars, where colonies thrived on distant planets, but where the authorities' control had grown ever tighter. He had been part of the resistance, a group fighting to overthrow the regime, but they were losing. Time itself had become their enemy, manipulated by the authority to crush any chance of rebellion. I fought for years, he said one night, as they sat in the lab, surrounded by the soft glow of the machines. I watched my friends die, my world crumble. I thought I could make a difference. But when I saw what the Chronosith did, when I saw entire cities wiped from existence, his voice broke, and he turned away, his hands trembling. That's when I knew I had to come back. To stop it before it ever began, Leora reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not alone anymore, Cassian. We'll stop it together." He looked at her then, and for the first time since he'd arrived, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. One night, after hours of reviewing data, Leora found herself sitting beside Cassian, their shoulders almost touching. The closeness between them had grown palpable, and despite the chaos swirling around them, there was an undeniable warmth in the space they shared. "Do you ever think about the future?" Cassian asked quietly, breaking the silence. Leora glanced at him, surprised by the question. "I used to," she admitted. "I used to think that if I worked hard enough, if I discovered the right things, I could create a future where everything was better, where people didn't have to suffer." Cassian nodded, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "I thought the same once. But the future is never what we think it'll be." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the world outside the lab seemed to fade away. The weight of time, of responsibility, of the mission they were on, it all fell to the background. All that mattered was the quiet connection between them, the unspoken understanding that had grown over the past few days. Leora felt her pulse quicken, and for the first time in years, she let herself feel something beyond the cold logic of science. She wasn't sure if it was love, but it was something close to it, something deeper than she had ever allowed herself to feel. Cassian reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was soft, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to be this close to her. But Leora didn't pull away. "I don't know what's going to happen," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "But whatever comes next, I'm glad I met you." Before she could respond, he leaned in, and their lips met in a soft, tentative kiss. It was brief, almost fragile, as if they were both afraid of breaking the moment. But in that kiss, Leora felt something shift, something undeniable. Time itself seemed to bend around them, pulling them closer together, as if the universe had been waiting for this moment. When they pulled apart, Cassian's eyes were filled with something she hadn't seen before, hope. But as the night wore on, and as the shadows grew longer, neither of them could ignore the ticking clock. Their mission was far from over, and the future, with all its uncertainty and danger, was fast approaching. In the distance, beyond the safety of the lab, forces were moving, forces that would stop at nothing to ensure that the future remained unchanged. And as Leora and Cassian prepared to face what lay ahead, they both knew that their greatest challenge was yet to come. I'll continue writing the next chapters in subsequent messages, due to length restrictions. Leora's mind whirled as she left Dr. Rune's lab, walking through the city streets with no destination in mind. The weight of the conversation pressed down on her, making each step feel heavier than the last. Her thoughts were a blur of Cassian's warnings, Dr. Rune's cryptic words, and her own mounting fears about the future. The certainty she once had about science, about her life, was crumbling under the weight of something she couldn't quite grasp. She needed to clear her head. The megacity stretched out before her, its towering skyscrapers gleaming in the fading sunlight, casting long shadows over the bustling streets below. People moved around her, caught up in their own worlds, oblivious to the existential threat Leora was wrestling with. For a fleeting moment, she wished she could be like them, unburdened by the knowledge of what might come. Her thoughts drifted back to Cassian. His presence had unsettled her from the moment he'd appeared in her lab. There was something about him, something raw and magnetic, a sadness in his eyes that pulled at her in ways she wasn't prepared to understand. She had spent so many years immersing herself in work, shutting out the possibility of love or even deep emotional connections. Her research had been her world. But now Cassian had stepped into that world, shattering its calm and bringing with him the storm of the future. As she crossed a pedestrian bridge that arched over the city's central canal, she found herself replaying their conversation. His voice had been urgent, filled with a kind of desperation that felt real. It was impossible to fake the weight of the pain she had seen in his eyes. Could someone so haunted by loss be lying? And then there was Dr. Rune. Leora trusted her mentor more than anyone, but there had been something in the older woman's voice, something veiled and secretive when she'd spoken about the fragility of time. Dr. Rune knew more than she was letting on, and that disturbed Leora more than she cared to admit. What was she hiding? Leora's thoughts were interrupted by the soft, familiar voice of Astra. "You've been walking for an hour, Leora. I've detected elevated heart rate and increased levels of cortisol. Would you like me to play some calming music?" Leora almost smiled. "I don't think music is going to solve this one." Astra, the AI assistant, paused before responding, her holographic orb shimmering softly beside Leora's shoulder. "If it's any consolation, I've been analyzing Cassian's device and the energy readings from the temporal anomaly. His claims are plausible." Leora stopped walking and leaned against the railing, staring out at the canal's dark, slow-moving water. "Plausible," she muttered. That's not exactly reassuring." "Astra, is anything ever fully reassuring when it comes to quantum mechanics?" Astra replied, her voice carrying a hint of sarcasm. "The more data I collect, the more I can confirm that he is, indeed, from the future. That much is clear. The energy signature of his device matches no known technology of our time. It's entirely consistent with the kind of chronolock mechanism he described. Leora sighed and rubbed her temples, feeling the onset of a headache. So he's telling the truth. Or at least part of it. She looked up at the darkening sky, her thoughts spinning. What about the rest of it?